My grandpa left me an old car as inheritance. But what was in the trunk made me shake. Jason Miller stared at the rusty keys in his hands, still processing the news that he'd inherited his grandpa's old car. His mother, Deborah, had insisted it was worthless junk, but something inside him told him to take one last look before selling it for scrap. When he opened the trunk of the 1980 brown Oldsmobile, his legs nearly gave out. There, hidden under a dusty top, was an old, heavy metal safe. His hands trembled as he turned the combination, which by some miracle was his grandma's birth date. What he saw inside took his breath away. Carefully wrapped gold bars and a stack of papers yellowed with time. "Mom, are you absolutely sure Grandpa George was just a retired mechanic?" Jason immediately called Deborah, his voice thick with disbelief. "Of course I'm sure, son. Why the strange question?" she replied, using that tone she always did when she didn't want to discuss things further. Jason hesitated before mentioning the safe. He knew his mother too well to think she'd hide something important from the family. But the discovery forced him to question everything he knew about the grandfather who raised him and his siblings after their parents' separation. The first document he examined was a deed for a property in Ridgewood, in the southern part of New York City. The buyer's name was unfamiliar, Walter Thompson. Jason had never heard of this man. Flipping through the other papers, he found more deeds, all with different names, all signed by his grandfather as either the seller or the middleman. "What kind of shady business was this, Grandpa?" he muttered to himself, sitting on the garage floor where he'd parked the car. The garage door slammed open. It was Karen, Jason's youngest aunt, her face red with anger and fists clenched. "I heard you took Dad's car," she said, not even bothering to greet her nephew. "I hope you know I'm entitled to half of whatever you find in there." Jason's stomach twisted. Karen had always been the one closest to their grandfather, caring for him in his final years, while Jason lived his life in another neighborhood, working as a computer technician and barely visiting. "Aunt Karen, I didn't even know I was inheriting this. You took care of him all those years. You have more right to it than I do," Jason said, genuinely embarrassed. "Don't give me that. Dad left that car to you for a reason, and I want to know why," Karen snapped, crossing her arms as if she wasn't leaving anytime soon. Jason glanced at the still open safe and made a decision that would change everything. He told her about the gold and the documents. Karen's face shifted from shock to disbelief, then finally to a mix of anger and greed he'd never seen before. "I knew it," she shouted, slamming her hand on the car's hood. "Dad always hid things from us, always had his secrets. And now we find out he was rich while I worked myself to the bone paying his medical bills." Her words hit Jason like a wave of guilt. It was true. Karen had sacrificed her own life to care for their father, working part-time just to be available when he needed her. Meanwhile, Jason only showed up on Sundays, if at all. "Aunt Karen, we can split everything. None of this matters to me," he said, trying to calm her down. "Split?" She let out a bitter laugh. "You think it's that simple? You have no idea what that man put me through, what he put our family through." Before Jason could ask what she meant, a woman's voice interrupted them. "Excuse me, are you related to Mr. George?" It was a white-haired, petite woman with thick glasses whom Jason didn't recognize. She held a basket of vegetables and looked at them with a serious expression. "I'm Hope, your neighbor for 40 years. I lived right there on the corner." She pointed to a small blue-painted house. "I need to talk to you about your grandfather. There are things you need to know." Jason and Karen exchanged glances. His aunt made an impatient gesture with her hand. "Spit it out, Mrs. Hope. What things?" The neighbor glanced around as if checking if anyone was listening, then stepped closer. "Your Grandpa George kept secrets for a lot of people in this neighborhood. Important secrets. And now that he's gone, some folks are getting nervous," she lowered her voice. "There are people who don't want certain truths to come out." "What kind of truths?" Jason felt a chill down his spine. "Your grandpa helped a lot of families here, but he also knew things he shouldn't have. And some folks are afraid his papers might fall into the wrong hands." Hope looked straight at the open safe. "You found the documents, didn't you?" Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us newcomers out. "Now back to the story." Jason nodded, and Mrs. Hope let out a deep sigh. "Then you need to be very careful. Some people will want those deeds at any cost." After the neighbor left, Leaving more questions than answers, Jason found himself alone with Karen and a tension that seemed to grow by the minute. He decided to examine the documents more closely, but every paper he read only deepened his confusion. The first deed was from 1995. His grandpa had bought a 200-square-meter lot under Walter Thompson's name for a price well above market value at the time. The second, from 1998, was another property bought under Dorothy Smith's name. The third, from 2001, recorded the purchase of a small house under Samuel Brown's name. "Auntie, do you know these people?" Jason showed the names to Karen. She took the papers and studied them carefully. Her expression shifted gradually from irritation to something like recognition. "Jason, I do know these people. All of them." Her voice had lost its earlier sharpness. "Walter owns the grocery store down the street. Dorothy is the lady who sews for everyone in the neighborhood. Samuel is the locksmith on Main Street." So what? Jason didn't understand where she was going with this. "All these people almost lost their homes and businesses over the years. I remember because Dad always talked about it, always worried about the neighbors." Karen sat on the floor beside her nephew. "But I never imagined he was involved like this." Jason felt a mix of pride and confusion. If his grandpa had been buying properties to help people, why keep it a secret? Why not tell the family? "There's more here," he said, pulling more documents from the safe. Among the papers were payment receipts, old invoices, and even some handwritten letters. One caught his eye because it was addressed to him. "To my grandson Jason, when you're ready to understand." With trembling hands, he opened the letter. His grandpa's handwriting, shaky in his later years, read, "My dear grandson, if you're reading this, it means you found my little treasure. Don't be afraid of what you'll discover. Every gold coin there was earned honestly. Every document has a story of hope behind it. I couldn't tell you in life because I knew you'd try to stop me from helping those in need. Look for Mrs. Carroll at 47 Independence Avenue. She has something that belongs to you." Jason showed the letter to Karen, who read it in silence. When it was over, her eyes were glistening. "Dad was always like that," she said, her voice choked up. "Always putting others before his own family." "Don't you think that's beautiful?" Jason asked, surprised by his aunt's bitter tone. "Beautiful?" Karen stood up abruptly. "Do you know how many times I asked him for help when my husband lost his job? How many times I told him I was struggling, and he always said he didn't have money to lend. Meanwhile, he was supporting half the neighborhood." The revelation hit Jason like a punch to the gut. He was starting to understand his aunt's resentment, but at the same time, he felt there was something she wasn't telling him. "Aunt, are you sure Grandpa knew about your struggles?" "What do you mean?" she shot back, defensive. "I don't know. Did you ever talk openly with him about money? Because I remember Grandpa was always pretty private about those things." Karen fell silent for a long moment. Jason realized he'd touched a nerve. "Look, Jason, your grandfather and I had our differences over the years. It wasn't always easy dealing with him." She sighed and sat back down. "But that doesn't matter now. What matters is figuring out what to do with that gold and those documents." Jason decided it was time to visit Mrs. Carroll. Independence Avenue was just 3 blocks away, in an older part of the neighborhood where the houses were smaller and the sidewalks uneven. Number 47 was a 2-story house painted light green with a small front porch. He rang the bell and waited. A woman in her 60s, thin with gray hair tied in a bun, opened the door. Her eyes widened when she saw Jason. "Oh my, you look just like your George when he was young," she said, covering her mouth with her hand. "You must be Jason." "Are you Mrs. Carroll?" he asked, still processing her reaction. "Yes, dear." "Come in, please. I've been expecting you." She led him inside. The living room was simple but cozy, with well-kept antique furniture and many photographs on the walls. Jason noticed his grandfather in several of them, always smiling beside people he didn't recognize. "Your grandfather was a very special man, Jason." Mrs. Carroll served coffee and sat across from him. "He helped me save this house when my husband got sick, and it wasn't just me. He helped half the neighborhood over the years." "Do you know about the documents and the gold?" Jason asked directly. "I know everything, dear. Your grandfather told me about the safe 2 years ago when he first got sick. He asked me to hold on to something for you. She stood and went to an old cabinet. Carol returned with a shoebox tied with string. Inside were more documents, but also old photographs and newspaper clippings. Here's your grandfather's real story, Jason. He didn't want his family to know because he was afraid you'd stop him from helping people. She showed him one of the photos. Look here. The picture was from a neighborhood festival, probably from the 90s. In the center, his grandfather stood surrounded by dozens of people, all smiling. Jason recognized some faces he still saw around town. Your grandfather organized these festivals to raise money for those in need. When that wasn't enough, he'd dip into his own pocket. Mrs. Carroll flipped through other documents. Here are receipts for everything he paid over the years. Medical bills, home loans, credit card debts, all without asking for a penny back. Jason felt increasingly moved and confused. Why had his grandfather hidden his generosity from his own family? Mrs. Carroll, why didn't he tell us about this? She hesitated, as if deciding how much to reveal. Your grandfather had a very difficult childhood, Jason. He lost his parents early and was raised by an aunt who couldn't provide for him. He promised himself he'd never let anyone go without if he could help it. She picked up another newspaper clipping. But he also knew family sometimes doesn't understand these things, especially after what happened with your Aunt Karen. What happened with Aunt Karen? Ms. Carroll looked at Jason with a worried expression. Maybe it's better if you talk to her about that, son. It's not my story to tell. When Jason got back home, he found Karen still in the garage, but now accompanied by a man he didn't know. He was tall, around 50, wearing a cheap suit with a serious expression. Jason, this is Dr. Henry, the family lawyer, Karen introduced him, but there was something in her tone that made him suspicious. Pleasure, Jason. Your aunt told me about the discovery you made. The man extended his hand, but his grip was too firm. We need to discuss some legal matters regarding the inheritance. Jason shook the lawyer's hand but stayed cautious. What kind of legal matters? Well, first we need to sort out the status of these assets. Gold has to be declared. These deeds need verification. Dr. Henry opened a folder he was carrying. But there's also a more delicate issue you should know about. The lawyer paused dramatically, looking from Jason to Karen. Your grandfather had some outstanding debts that are now the responsibility of the heirs. Jason felt the ground drop beneath him. What kind of debts? Private loans. Quite a bit of money, actually. The man checked his papers. About $200,000, with interest accrued over the last 3 years. Karen turned pale. $200,000? Where did my father get all that money? According to our records, he borrowed to pay off other people's debts. It was always like that, co-signing for others. Dr. Henry closed the folder. The problem is now the creditors want payment, and you're the only heirs. Jason felt like he was in a nightmare. The gold that seemed like a blessing had suddenly turned into a curse. If the debts were real, they'd have to hand everything over and still owe more. Doctor, how can we verify if these debts are legitimate? He asked, trying to stay calm. I can help with that, but it'll cost some fees. And in the meantime, I recommend you don't touch the gold. The lawyer handed him a card. Call me tomorrow, and we'll sort this out. After the man left, Jason and Karen stood in silence for a long time. His aunt was the first to speak. Jason, I think we should sell everything and split the money before more complications arise. And shouldn't we look into these debts first? This lawyer came out of nowhere. Don't you think it's strange? Strange, Karen raised her voice. Strange is finding out my father hid a fortune from the family while I worked myself to the bone taking care of him. The argument was cut short by the arrival of Deborah, Jason's mother. She came in breathless, as if she'd been running. Jason, honey, what's this about a safe and a lawyer? She glanced at the still open trunk. Karen called me saying things I didn't quite understand. Jason explained everything to his mother, from finding the safe to the lawyer's sudden appearance. Deborah listened quietly, but her expression grew tenser by the minute. Mom, did you know anything about this? Jason asked finally. Deborah took a deep breath and sat on the wooden bench at the back of the garage. Jason, your grandfather and I fought over this years ago. I found out he was helping strangers while his own family struggled. She looked at Karen. Your aunt would sometimes ask for help, and he'd always say he didn't have the money. Mom, do you think the debts the lawyer mentioned are real? I don't know, son. But I do know your grandpa was capable of going into debt to help others. That's just how he was. Deborah picked up one of the gold bars. Look at this. He must have saved this for years to help those in need. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. That night, Jason couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about everything he'd discovered in just one day. The grandpa he knew was a simple man who worked at the neighborhood auto shop and spent Sundays watching soccer on TV. But now he was uncovering a whole life of secrets behind that apparent simplicity. The next morning, he decided to do his own investigation. He started by visiting Walter, the owner of the grocery store whose name appeared on the first deed. He found the man arranging vegetables in front of the shop. Mr. Walter, did you know my grandpa, George Miller? The man looked up and a wide smile spread across his face. Jason, of course I did. Your grandpa was an angel in my life. Walter set down what he was doing and stepped closer. When I was about to lose this store to the bank, he showed up out of nowhere offering help. What do you mean, Mr. Walter? Son, it was 1995. I'd taken out a loan to renovate the store. But business didn't pick up, and I couldn't pay it back. The bank was going to foreclose. Walter shook his head, remembering the tough times. Then your grandpa came by one day and said he wanted to buy the store's lot. He paid the bank in full, but told me I could stay here for the rest of my life, just paying a token rent. Jason felt a lump in his throat. And you never knew why he did that? Your grandpa always said he'd struggled when he was young and didn't want to see anyone else suffer. Walter smiled. But I think he did it because his heart was bigger than his body. The second visit was to Dorothy Smith, the seamstress. She lived in a small yellow house that also served as her tiny workshop. When Jason introduced himself, she started crying before he even explained why he was there. Your grandpa was like a father to me, Jason, she said, dabbing her tears with a tissue. When my husband left me with 3 young kids, I didn't know how I'd keep up with the mortgage. And my grandpa helped you. Not only did he help, but he made sure no one knew. He paid all the overdue installments and even put the house in my name so I'd feel secure. Dorothy showed Jason some clothes she was sewing. In return, he only asked me to sew a few pieces for him now and then. But he never charged me a thing. Do you know if he had debts because of all this help? Dorothy looked at Jason with concern. Jason, your grandpa was always very careful with money. He only helped when he knew he could. I never saw him go into debt for anyone. She hesitated. But these last few years he seemed worried about something. Worried how? I can't quite explain. He was always a cheerful man, but lately it felt like he was carrying a heavy weight on his shoulders. On his way home, Jason stopped at a bakery for coffee and to think. He was starting to see a different side of his grandpa, but more questions were piling up. If he was so careful with money, where did the debts the lawyer mentioned come from? His phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. Hello? Jason, it's Mrs. Hope, the neighbor who spoke with you yesterday. The woman's voice sounded tense. I need to talk to you urgently. Can you come to my house? Did something happen, Mrs. Hope? Some people showed up here asking about your grandfather, people I'd never seen in the neighborhood before. She lowered her voice. Jason, I think you're in danger. Jason felt a shiver run down his spine. He left the bakery almost at a run and went straight to Mrs. Hope's house. She was waiting for him on the porch, nervously glancing around. Come inside quickly, son, she said, pulling him into the house. Who were these people who came by? 2 men in suits, driving a black car. They said they were lawyers, but I didn't like the look of them. Mrs. Hope handed Jason a glass of water. They asked a lot of questions about your grandfather. They wanted to know if he'd told any secrets to someone in the neighborhood. What kind of secrets? Jason, there are things I didn't tell you yesterday. Your grandfather didn't just help people around here. He also knew things some folks wanted to keep hidden. She sat down beside him. There were people who came to this neighborhood to do shady business, thinking no one would suspect. But your grandfather saw everything and wrote it all down. Jason felt his blood run cold. Mrs. Hope, Are you saying my grandfather was being threatened? Not threatened, but pressured. In his last few months, he was very on edge. He said some people wanted him to forget certain things he'd seen. She took Jason's hand. Son, I think those documents you found might be dangerous. When Jason got home, he found Karen in a panic. She was hurriedly putting the gold bars back in the safe. Jason, where were you? A man came by looking for you. She slammed the safe shut. He said he was Dr. Henry's associate and needed to talk urgently about Dad's debts. What did he look like? Tall, thin, with a scar on his face. He had an aggressive way about him. Karen was visibly shaking. Jason, I think we've gotten into something really serious. Jason told his aunt what he'd learned from Mrs. Hope. The two pieces of information together painted a frightening picture. His grandfather had been involved in something far bigger than just helping neighbors. Aunt, where are the documents? They're in the safe. But Jason, I think we should hand everything over to this lawyer and wash our hands of this mess. Karen seemed genuinely scared. Aunt, what if this lawyer isn't who he says he is? Did you check his credentials? Karen froze. What credentials? Bar association card, professional license, things like that. Jason could tell from her expression she hadn't thought of that. Jason, I didn't think to check. She sank heavily into a chair. I was so worried about the debts I didn't even consider he might be lying. At that moment, Jason made a decision. He needed to uncover the truth about his grandfather before doing anything with the gold or the documents. And he had a feeling Mrs. Carroll knew more than she'd let on. He went back to the house on Independence Avenue, but this time he found Mrs. Carroll visibly nervous. She looked around before letting him in. Jason, thank God you came back. I need to tell you something very important. She led him to the kitchen, away from the front windows. Mrs. Carroll, strange men have been asking about my grandfather. Do you know what this is about? Yes, son. And that's why I need to tell you the whole truth. She pulled a chair closer. Your grandfather wasn't just a generous man. He was also a very brave one. What do you mean? Jason, about 5 years ago, men started showing up in the neighborhood, offering money for people to sell their homes. Offers way above market value, Carol said quietly, as if someone might be listening. At first, everyone was tempted, but your grandpa got suspicious. Suspicious of what? He started investigating and found out these men worked for a company that wanted to build a shopping center here. Only they didn't want to pay fair prices for the houses. They wanted to force everyone to sell cheap. She pulled an old notebook from a drawer. Your grandpa wrote everything down here. Names, dates, conversations he overheard. Jason flipped through the notebook. It was his grandpa's handwriting, but the notes looked like a full-blown investigation file. Carol, was my grandpa spying on these people? Not spying, Jason. Protecting. When he figured out their plan, he started buying the houses they were pressuring. Paid fair prices to the residents and let them keep living there. She pointed to a specific page in the notebook. Look here. Your grandpa saved 12 families from being pushed out of the neighborhood. Jason was starting to grasp the scale of what his grandpa had done. It wasn't just generosity, it was resistance. He'd used his savings to stop real estate speculators from destroying the community. But Carol, where did he get that much money? Oh, Jason, your grandpa was always very frugal. He worked at the shop during the day, but he had other little businesses too. Bought old cars, fixed them up, sold them. Did that for decades, she smiled fondly. And he never spent a dime on himself. His house was simple, his clothes were simple. Every penny he saved, he kept so he could help when needed. And this gold? The gold was payment he got for a piece of land he sold downtown. Land that had been in the family for generations. Carol turned a few more pages in the notebook. He sold it to have enough money to buy all the houses here that were under threat. Jason felt a wave of pride and sadness at the same time. His grandpa had sacrificed the family's inheritance to save strangers. Carol, why did he never tell us any of this? Because he was afraid you'd try to stop him, and because he knew it could be dangerous. She closed the notebook. Those speculators didn't give up, Jason. They still want to build that shopping center. And now that your grandpa's gone, they think they can intimidate you into handing over the documents. What documents do they want? The deeds to the houses your grandpa bought. If they get those, they can force the families out anyway. Carol held Jason's hand. Jason, those papers aren't just documents. They're the protection of 12 families. When Jason got home this time, his mind was racing with everything he'd learned. His grandpa wasn't just a generous man. He was a quiet hero who'd spent his whole life protecting his community, and now that responsibility had fallen on his shoulders. He found Karen in the living room, whispering on the phone. When she saw him, she quickly hung up. "Who was that?" Jason asked. It was Dr. Henry. He said the creditors are getting impatient and want an answer by tomorrow." She avoided her nephew's eyes. Jason felt something was off. His aunt's behavior had changed ever since that supposed lawyer showed up. "Auntie, can I see the documents he brought about these debts?" "Documents?" Karen looked surprised. "He didn't bring any. Said he'd get them and bring them tomorrow." Jason's suspicion deepened. What kind of serious lawyer demands payment without showing proof? "Auntie, I think this man is trying to scam us." Jason sat beside her. "I found out some things about Grandpa that explain everything." He told Karen the whole story that Carol had shared. He talked about the real estate speculators, about the houses her grandfather had bought to protect the families, about the land he sold to have enough money. Karen listened quietly, but her expression grew increasingly tense. "Jason, are you sure this story is true?" she asked finally. "I am, Aunt. I spoke with several people Grandpa helped. They all say the same thing." Jason noticed his aunt still seemed skeptical. "Why are you doubting this?" "It's not that I'm doubting, Jason. It's too much of a coincidence that this lawyer shows up right now." Karen stood and walked to the window. What if he's really legitimate? What if Dad really had these debts? Jason sensed there was something his aunt wasn't telling him. Her resistance to believing the story didn't seem natural. "Aunt, did something happen you're not telling me about?" Karen was silent for a long moment. When she turned to look at Jason, her eyes were filled with tears. "Jason, I need to tell you something, but you have to promise not to judge me." She sat back down, trembling slightly. "Go ahead, Aunt." 3 years ago, when my husband lost his job, we went through a really tough time, really tough. Karen wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "I went to Dad several times asking for help. It wasn't a gift. It was a loan. I was going to pay it all back." "What happened?" "He always said he didn't have the money, that his pension barely covered his own bills." She sobbed. "Jason, I was humiliated. I had to borrow food from neighbors because I had nothing to feed my kids." Jason felt his heart tighten. He was beginning to understand his aunt's resentment. "And then?" "Then I found out he was helping others. I saw him giving money to Dorothy Smith. I saw him paying for groceries for Walter Thompson's family." Karen was openly crying now. "And I didn't understand, Jason. Why would he help strangers but not his own daughter?" The pain in her voice was palpable. Jason started to realize the story was more complicated than he'd thought. "Aunt, did you ever talk to him about this?" "I tried, but he always changed the subject. Said every case was different." Karen stood again. "Jason, I know Dad was a good man, but he was also stubborn, and sometimes his stubbornness hurt those closest to him." Jason stayed silent, processing what he'd heard. For the first time since discovering the safe, he could see things from his aunt's perspective. Grandpa may have been a hero to the neighborhood, but to her, he'd been a distant father when she needed him most. "Aunt, what if we talked to all those neighbors Grandpa helped? Maybe they'd have an idea how to fix this," Jason suggested. "Jason, I don't want to be involved anymore. I'm scared of those men who showed up." Karen gripped her nephew's arm. "Let's just hand everything over to that lawyer and be done with it. If it's a scam, so be it. At least we'll be free of this responsibility." It was then Jason realized something crucial. His aunt didn't just want to be rid of the problem, she wanted to be rid of her father's memory. The discovery of the treasure had reopened old wounds she'd rather keep closed. "Aunt, what if we split things differently?" Jason offered. "You take your share of the gold, and I'll handle the documents and the houses." Karen looked at him in surprise. "You'd do that?" "I would. I think everyone should deal with Grandpa's legacy in their own way. Jason took his aunt's hand. But please give me a few days to investigate this lawyer story further. Karen agreed, and Jason felt he had managed to buy some precious time. Now he needed to find out who those men really were and what they wanted. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The next morning, Jason decided to do something he hadn't done in years: visit the garage where his grandpa had worked for over 3 decades. The garage was still there, now run by Andy, who had been his grandpa's apprentice. Jason, what a surprise to see you here, Andy said, putting down the wrench he was holding and walking over to greet him. I'm so sorry about your grandpa's passing. He was like a father to me. Thank you, Andy. Actually, I came here because I need to know some things about Grandpa, Jason said, looking around the garage, which had barely changed since his childhood. Ask away, son. If I know, I'll tell you. Do you know if my grandpa had any debts, or if he owed money to anyone? Andy laughed, shaking his head. Jason, your grandpa was the most careful person with money I've ever known. He even wrote down every penny he spent on soda, he said, pointing to a drawer. Look here, his notebooks are still there. Jason opened the drawer and found several small notebooks, all filled with his grandpa's neat handwriting. They were detailed records of all the garage's expenses and earnings, organized by date and category. Andy, can I borrow these notebooks? Of course, Jason, but tell me something. Why are you asking about debts? Jason told him about the supposed lawyer showing up and the claims about unpaid loans. Andy listened with an increasingly serious expression. Jason, that's definitely a scam, he said finally. Your grandpa never borrowed money from anyone. If he needed cash for something, he'd sell a car he'd fixed or take on extra work. Are you sure? Absolutely. In fact, in recent years, he even offered to lend me money when I was struggling, Andy said, opening another notebook. Look here. He wrote down every loan he gave to other people, only loans he gave, never ones he took. Jason flipped through the notebook and was amazed. There were dozens of records of loans his grandpa had made to people in the neighborhood. Small amounts, but for those in need, it made all the difference. Did these people pay him back? Some did, some didn't. But your grandpa never pressured anyone. He said if you lend to help, you shouldn't expect it back, Andy smiled. It was his way of doing charity without humiliating anyone. Jason left the garage with the notebooks under his arm, and one certainty: the lawyer was indeed a fraud. Now he needed to figure out how they knew about the safe and the documents. He decided to test it. He called the number the so-called Dr. Henry had given him. Hello, law office, a woman's voice answered. I'd like to speak with Dr. Henry, please. Dr. Henry? We don't have any lawyer by that name here, the woman sounded confused. But he gave me this number, saying it was his office. Sir, there must be some mistake. This is the office of Dr. Michael Stewart. Would you like me to take a message and check if anyone here knows this Dr. Henry? Jason hung up without leaving a message. His suspicion was confirmed. Now he needed to figure out how to protect the documents and the gold from the real scammers. He returned home to a scene that terrified him. The garage door was open, and there were clear signs someone had tampered with the car. The safe was still there, but some of the documents were out of place. He rushed into the house looking for Karen, but she was nowhere to be found. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Jason began to panic. That's when he saw a note stuck to the fridge in handwriting he didn't recognize. Jason, if you want to see your aunt again, bring the property documents to the supermarket parking lot on Main Street by 7 p.m. Come alone. Jason's world crumbled. The scammers had kidnapped Karen, and now he was completely alone to deal with the situation. He checked the clock. It was 5:30 p.m. He had just over an hour to decide what to do. His first instinct was to call the police, but the note clearly said to come alone. What if they hurt his aunt if he didn't obey? Karen might have her flaws, but she was the only family he had left besides his mother. Jason gathered the property documents and hid the rest of the gold in a safe place. If he had to hand over the papers, at least he'd save the money that could help others in the future. But as he was leaving the house, an idea struck him. He called Mrs. Carroll. Mrs. Carroll, I need your help urgently. They took my aunt. Jason quickly explained what had happened. "Jason, don't go alone. These men are dangerous." She sounded deeply worried. "But I can't just leave my aunt, and I can't call the police because they might hurt her." "Jason, listen to me. I'll call some people from the neighborhood, folks who owe your grandpa favors." Mrs. Carroll spoke fast. "They won't let you face this alone." "Mrs. Carroll, I don't want to drag more people into this mess." "Jason, your grandpa spent his whole life protecting this neighborhood. Now it's time for the neighborhood to protect his family." She hung up before he could protest. Jason headed to the supermarket, but arrived 15 minutes early to scope out the scene. The parking lot was moderately busy with evening shoppers. At exactly 7 p.m., a black car pulled up near where Jason was waiting. Two men stepped out. One was the so-called Dr. Henry. The other was the scar-faced man Karen had described. "Jason, did you bring the documents?" The fake lawyer approached, hands in his pockets. "Where's my aunt?" "She's fine. And she'll stay fine if you cooperate." The scar-faced man spoke for the first time. "The documents." Jason hesitated. Part of him wanted to hand everything over to ensure Karen's safety, but another part thought of the 12 families who'd be left unprotected. "First, I want to see my aunt." Jason tried to buy time. Then something unexpected happened. Several cars began pulling into the parking lot all at once. Jason recognized some faces. They were neighbors, people he'd visited in recent days. Mr. Walter stepped out of an old pickup truck. Dorothy Smith emerged from a small car with two other women. Samuel, the locksmith, arrived on a motorcycle. Within minutes, about 20 people had discreetly surrounded the area where Jason stood with the two men. "What is this?" The fake lawyer looked around, visibly nervous. "These are people who owe my grandpa favors," Jason said, feeling braver. "And now they're going to help me settle this." Mr. Walter stepped forward. "Jason, where's your aunt?" he asked, though his eyes stayed fixed on the two men. "They know where she is," Jason pointed at the scammers. "Listen here," the scar-faced man tried to sound threatening. "This is a private matter. Stay out of it." Dorothy laughed. "Private? You took George's daughter. That makes it everyone's business here." She crossed her arms. "Where is she?" The two men exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this turn of events. The parking lot was full of familiar faces from the neighborhood, people who had worked and lived there for decades. "Look, here's the deal." The fake lawyer tried to regain control. "You hand over the documents we want, and we return the woman. Simple as that." "What documents?" Samuel Brown stepped closer. "What do you want with Grandpa George's papers?" It was Carol who arrived just then and explained the situation to everyone. She told them about the shopping center project, how their grandfather had bought the houses to protect the families, and how these men represented the real estate speculators. "So that's it," Walter Thompson shook his head. "You want to kick us out of our homes?" "It's not like that," the fake lawyer tried to explain. "You'll receive fair compensation." "Fair, according to who?" Dorothy Smith raised her voice. "You want to push us out of the neighborhood we've lived in for decades just to build another shopping mall?" The situation was growing tense, but Jason Miller realized he had the upper hand. The scammers were outnumbered and surrounded by people who had personal reasons to protect him. "Where's my aunt?" Jason asked again, more firmly this time. The scarred man glanced at the fake lawyer, who gave a subtle signal. Jason noticed they were communicating somehow. "She's in the car over there behind those trees." The fake lawyer pointed to a darker area of the parking lot. "But we'll only let her go once we have the documents. And if I don't hand them over, then she won't be going home today," the scarred man replied coldly. Jason looked around at all the people who had come to help him, people he barely knew, but who were there out of loyalty to his grandfather. It was amazing to see how his grandfather's legacy of kindness had created a safety net even after his passing. "Fine," Jason finally said. "I'll get the documents from the car." But instead of heading to his own car, he walked toward where the scammers had pointed. He wanted to make sure Karen was really there before making any decisions. Behind the trees was another black car with tinted windows. Jason approached and heard a thud coming from the trunk. It was Karen. "Auntie, are you okay?" he whispered near the car. "Jason? Jason, get me out of here!" Karen's voice was muffled, but he could tell she was unharmed. Jason returned to where the others stood, but now he had a plan. "I saw my aunt. She's in the trunk of your car," he told the scammers. "Now I want to make a deal." "What kind of deal?" The fake lawyer sounded impatient. "You release my aunt now, and I'll hand over half the documents. The other half comes when I know she's safe." Jason crossed his arms. "And there's one more condition." "What?" "You drop the shopping center project for good." The scarred man laughed. "You think you're in any position to make demands?" That's when Walter Thompson stepped forward. "Actually, I think he is." He looked around at all the neighbors present. "Look how many people are here. Look how many witnesses you have to your crimes." "Crimes?" The fake lawyer tried to sound indignant. "What crimes?" "Kidnapping, extortion, fraud," Samuel Brown counted on his fingers. "And that's just from today," Dorothy Smith added. "And attempted real estate fraud because you're trying to steal homes from poor families." Jason realized the situation had completely shifted. The scammers were surrounded and exposed, with dozens of witnesses to their crimes. They no longer had the advantage. "Listen, here's what we'll do." The fake lawyer changed his tone. "We'll release the woman and leave. You keep the documents, and everyone forgets this ever happened." "No," Jason replied firmly. "You're going to release my aunt, apologize to her for the mistreatment, and sign a document promising never to come back to this neighborhood." "And what if we don't want to?" Mrs. Carroll stepped closer to the group at that moment. "Then you'll explain to the police why you kidnapped an innocent woman." She held up her phone. "Because I've already called them. They should be here any minute." It was a lie, but the scammers didn't know that. The fake lawyer and the man with the scar exchanged glances again, clearly trying to decide what to do. That's when Jason heard a familiar voice shouting in the distance. "Jason! Jason, where are you?" It was Deborah, his mother, running toward the group. Behind her came more people from the neighborhood, including some men Jason didn't recognize. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "Mrs. Carroll called me and told me what was happening." "I wasn't going to let you face this alone." Deborah glared at the two scammers with fury. "Where's Karen?" "She's in the trunk of that car, Mom," Jason pointed. "Then get her out of there right now." Deborah shouted at the men, who seemed to shrink under the rage of a mother protecting her son. The situation had become unbearable for the scammers. They were surrounded by over 30 people in a public place, with multiple witnesses to their crimes. Jason realized he'd won. All right. The fake lawyer raised his hands. "We'll release the woman and leave." "And the document?" Jason insisted. "What document?" "Signing that you'll never come back here or try to buy houses in this neighborhood again." Mr. Walter pulled a piece of paper and a pen from his pocket. "I'll write down what you need to say," he said, "and everyone here will be a witness." The scammers had no choice. They signed the paper, promising not to return to the neighborhood, and went to release Karen. When she stepped out of the trunk, she was pale and shaking but seemed unharmed. "Jason!" She ran and hugged him. "I thought I'd never see you again." "It's okay, Auntie. It's over." Jason hugged her back, feeling overwhelming relief. The scammers' two cars sped out of the parking lot under the watchful eyes of all the neighbors. Jason knew they wouldn't return. There were too many witnesses against them, and they knew they'd lost the battle. "Jason," Mrs. Carroll approached. "Your grandfather would be proud to see how the neighborhood came together to protect his family." "Mrs. Carroll, how did you get so many people here so fast?" "Honey, your grandfather built a network of solidarity here that'll last generations. Every person he helped told others, and those people told even more." She smiled. "When someone from George's family needs help, word spreads in minutes." Jason looked around at all these people he barely knew, who had dropped everything to help him. For the first time, he fully understood the magnitude of the legacy his grandfather had left. In the days that followed, Jason made some important decisions. First, he had a long talk with Karen about the resentment she'd held toward her father. His aunt admitted she'd always felt overlooked compared to the neighbors, but after seeing how the entire neighborhood mobilized to help them, she began to understand that her father hadn't distinguished between family and community. To him, everyone was equally important. "Jason, I think Dad saw me as someone strong, who could handle things on my own." Karen said one afternoon as they had coffee in their grandfather's kitchen. But he saw the neighbors as people who needed protection. You think that's what it was? I do, and maybe he was right. I managed, didn't I? It might have been hard, but I got through it. She smiled for the first time in days. Maybe Dad knew I was stronger than I ever imagined. Jason also talked to his mother about the revelation that she had fought with his grandpa because of the help he gave to the neighbors. Mom, why did you never tell me you argued with Grandpa? Because I was ashamed, son, Deborah admitted. After he passed, I realized I was wrong. He was building something bigger than we could see at the time. Do you regret the fights? I regret them deeply, but I also learned an important lesson. She took her son's hand. Sometimes we don't understand the motivations of the people we love, and by the time we do, it might be too late to apologize. Jason decided to organize a meeting with all the families who had been helped by his grandpa. He wanted to better understand what each one had received and how they could honor his memory together. The meeting was held at Carol's house, which had the largest backyard. 23 people showed up, representing 12 different families. Each shared their story of how Grandpa had helped them, and Jason was amazed by the variety of situations. There were simple cases like paying a late electricity bill to more complex ones like preventing evictions and funding medical treatments. But what struck Jason the most was discovering that Grandpa didn't just give money. He also offered emotional support, practical advice, and sometimes just a friendly conversation to those going through tough times. George saved my marriage, said Irene, a gray-haired woman. When my husband was drinking too much, he sat with both of us and talked for hours. He didn't give money or unsolicited advice. He just listened and asked the right questions at the right time. He taught me how to budget, said Clyde, a young man. When I got married, I didn't know how to manage household money. Your grandpa called me into his workshop and showed me how to track every expense. That's why I've never struggled since. Jason realized Grandpa had been much more than a silent benefactor. He had been a true mentor to the community, someone who understood that helping people went far beyond giving money. Everyone, I'd like to propose something, Jason said at the end of the meeting. What if we found a way to continue my grandpa's work? How so? Asked Walter. The gold he left could become a community fund. We use it to help those in need, but in an organized way. Jason had been thinking about this for days. And the house deeds stay protected forever, so no one gets forced out of here. The idea was met with enthusiasm by everyone. They formed a community management group with 5 people responsible for overseeing the fund and deciding how to use the money. Clear rules were set: priority for emergencies, interest-free loans for those in need, and the expectation that anyone who received help would later contribute something back to the community. It's like a chain of kindness, Dorothy Smith summarized. Whoever gets help later helps someone else. Jason also had an important conversation with Hope, the neighbor who had warned him about the scammers. Hope, how did you know those men were dangerous? Son, when you've lived in a place long enough, you learn to recognize who belongs and who doesn't, she explained. They looked like they were here to take advantage, not to help. And how did you know about the secrets my grandpa kept? Jason, your grandpa was discreet, but he wasn't blind or deaf. He saw everything that happened in the neighborhood. Hope smiled. And sometimes he'd share what worried him. Not to gossip, but to lighten the burden of carrying so many secrets alone. What kind of secrets? Family secrets, mostly. Who was struggling financially but was too ashamed to admit it? Who was dealing with health problems but hiding them from their family? Who was being mistreated but didn't know how to ask for help, she sighed. Your grandfather was like a lay priest for the neighborhood. Everyone came to him to share their sorrows. Jason began to understand why his grandfather had carried so much weight on his shoulders. He wasn't just generous with money. He was generous with his time, attention, and emotional care. That explained why he sometimes seemed distant from his own family. He was tending to the pain of dozens of people at once. A week after the community meeting, Jason received an unexpected visit. It was a woman in her 50s, well-dressed, driving a new Oldsmobile. She introduced herself as Valerie Sanders, daughter of Samuel, the locksmith. Jason, my father told me everything that happened, about how your grandfather helped our family. and about the community fund you all created. She seemed nervous. I came here to make a proposal. What kind of proposal? I'm a lawyer. I work for a big firm downtown. I want to offer my services for free to help sort out this whole situation. Valerie pulled a folder from her bag. The property deeds, the community fund, everything needs to be legally protected. Jason was surprised. He hadn't expected his grandfather's kindness to inspire a second generation of people willing to give back. Valerie, why do you want to do this? Because your grandfather paid for my education, Jason, she said simply. When I got into law school, my father couldn't afford the tuition. Your grandfather showed up at our house with an offer. He'd pay for my studies if I promised to use my knowledge to help the community once I graduated. And you promised? I did. And now it's time to keep that promise. She smiled. Besides, my father told me how you all stood up to those scammers. It made me realize the neighborhood I grew up in is special. It's worth protecting. In the following months, Valerie worked tirelessly to set up the legal framework needed to safeguard his grandfather's legacy. She established an officially registered community association, transferred the property deeds to the association, ensuring residents kept lifetime occupancy rights, and set up a conservative investment fund to make the gold money grow over time. Jason also discovered others who had been helped by his grandfather and now wanted to contribute. There was a doctor who offered free monthly checkups for the community, an accountant who volunteered to do tax returns at no cost, and even a small business owner who created priority job openings for local youth. Jason, your grandfather planted seeds that are still sprouting today, Carol remarked one afternoon when they ran into each other at the bakery. He never imagined his kindness would multiply like this. Carol, there's something I've been meaning to ask you, Jason said. Why did my grandfather leave the inheritance to me instead of my aunt, who took care of him all these years? Carol thought for a moment before answering. Jason, I think your grandfather knew Karen was hurt by him, and he knew she wouldn't be able to separate that hurt from the responsibility. She took a sip of coffee. You, on the other hand, were removed from the family conflicts. You were emotionally ready to understand what he was trying to do. Do you think he planned all this? I think he hoped you'd uncover the truth about his help, yes. And he hoped you'd choose to carry on the work. Carol smiled. Your grandfather understood people's hearts, Jason. He knew you'd do the right thing. 6 months after the discovery of the safe, Jason organized a party in honor of his grandpa. It was held at the same spot where Carol had shown the photo of the old summer festival. The neighborhood field behind the school. Over 100 people showed up. There were longtime residents who had known his grandpa for decades, young folks who had grown up in the neighborhood and were now studying or working thanks to his indirect help, and even some people from nearby areas who had heard the story. Jason prepared a speech, but when the time came to speak, he realized words weren't necessary. What was happening there was the greatest tribute his grandpa could receive. A united community, people looking out for one another, and the certainty that his kindness had created something lasting. Everyone, I won't make a long speech, Jason said into the microphone borrowed from the school. I just want to say my grandpa would have been so happy to see all of you here today, and he'd be even happier to know his work didn't end when he passed. The party lasted late into the night. There was music, food, games for the kids, and countless stories about his grandpa. Jason realized each person had a different memory of him, but they all shared the same feelings of gratitude and affection. At the end of the night, when almost everyone had left, Jason stayed alone in the field for a few minutes. He looked at the houses around him, thinking of all the families living there quietly protected by his grandpa's care. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Karen. Jason, thank you for helping me understand Daddy. Today, I finally forgave him completely, and I forgave myself too. I love you. Jason smiled. That might have been the greatest victory of all. His aunt's reconciliation with her father's memory meant the family was finally at peace. When he got home that night, Jason went to the garage where it had all begun. The brown Oldsmobile was still there, but now it held a completely different meaning. It wasn't just an old inherited car anymore. It was the symbol of a discovery that had transformed his life and the lives of so many others. Jason made one last decision. He would learn how to fix cars. He wanted to work at the shop that had been his grandpa's, learning from Andy and keeping alive that tradition of honest work and care for the community. It wasn't just about honoring his grandpa's memory. It was a way to ensure there would always be someone from the family ready to listen, advise, and help when needed. His grandpa's legacy of kindness wouldn't die with him. It would be passed down through generations. 2 years later, Jason was working at the shop when a young woman appeared holding a child. "Mr. Jason?" she asked timidly. "My name is Jessica. Mrs. Carroll said you might be able to help me." "Of course, Jessica. What's the trouble?" "My husband left me and took the car. I work as a house cleaner, but without transportation it's been really hard. Mrs. Carroll thought maybe you had an affordable car I could buy in installments." She rocked the baby in her arms. "It doesn't have to be pretty. It just needs to run." Jason smiled. It was exactly the kind of situation his grandpa had faced all the time. He glanced at the brown Oldsmobile parked at the back of the shop. He'd spent the last 2 years restoring it, not to sell it, but to keep it as a keepsake. "Jessica, how much can you pay each month?" "About $200 at most. I know it's not much, but..." "It's not too little," Jason interrupted. "It's just the right amount." He made her an offer. Jessica would pay $200 a month for 2 years. At the end of that time, the car would be hers. But in the meantime, she would commit to helping others in the community whenever possible, taking seniors to the doctor, picking up kids from school when parents were working, things like that. "Really?" Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "You'd do that for me?" "It's not me doing it, Jessica. It's my grandpa. He left all this so people like you could have a fresh start." Jason handed her the keys. "Take good care of it. It's a special car." As he watched Jessica drive off in the Oldsmobile, Jason felt a deep peace. The circle was complete. The car that had revealed his grandpa's secret was now fulfilling its true purpose, helping someone rebuild their life. Jason picked up his phone and called Deborah. "Mom, I think I finally understand what Grandpa wanted to teach me." "What is it, son?" "That inheritance isn't just money or possessions. It's the example we leave for the next generations." Jason looked around the garage. "And his example will live on as long as there are people willing to help others." "Your grandpa would be proud of you, Jason." "I think he already knew I'd figure it out, Mom. That's why he left that safe where I could find it." Jason smiled. He was always smarter than we realized. That night, Jason made one last entry in the notebook he'd started for the community fund. It was a record of everyone helped, every situation resolved, all the small miracles that happened when people chose to care for one another. The last line he wrote was, "Today I gave Grandpa's car to Jessica. I think he'd approve." The chain continues. He closed the notebook and looked out the window. The neighborhood was quiet, most houses already dark. But Jason knew behind every window were stories of resilience, dreams being built, and families sleeping soundly because they knew they had a support network around them. Grandpa's legacy was no longer hidden in a safe in a car trunk. It was spread across the streets, the homes, the hearts of everyone who'd learned that caring for others is the surest way to build a better world. Jason turned off the light and went to bed, knowing tomorrow would bring new people needing help, new challenges to face, new chances to make a difference. And knowing, too, that he was ready to keep honoring the memory of the man who'd transformed an entire neighborhood through quiet acts of kindness. The brown 1980 Oldsmobile now roamed the streets with Jessica behind the wheel, carrying a new story of hope. And in the garage where it all began, Jason worked every day, fixing not just broken cars, but lives in need of a second chance. Grandpa George's inheritance had become something far greater than gold or money. It had become a living legacy of solidarity, one that would keep growing as long as there were people willing to believe small gestures can change the world. End of story. Now tell me what you thought of this story and where you're watching from. If you have something to share, leave us an honest comment. What would you do if you discovered a treasure like Jason? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss other heartwarming stories.